Hello. Tonight we're going to read Max Goes to the Space Station. Tori and her family had just arrived at the playground with Max. Tori and her brother ran ahead. Max could barely contain his excitement, but he waited obediently until Tori's dad gave him the okay. Then Max raced to the merry-go-round, where he began circling it and pushing it with his paws. Soon it was spinning fast. Tori and her brother held on tight. Max hopped on and off, sometimes riding and sometimes pushing it along faster. When the merry-go-round finally came to a stop, a woman walked over to Tori. "Your dog is amazing," said the woman. "Does he go down the slide too?" "I don't know," replied Tori. "He might if we help him up the ladder." The woman helped Tori and her dad, and sure enough, Max slid down the slide. The woman turned to Tori's dad. "Please call," she said, handing him a business card with a photo of the International Space Station. "I have an idea for your dog." Later that day, at home, Max was in the backyard wrestling with a big stick. Tori was inside doing her homework. Her dad was on the phone talking to the woman who'd given him the business card. "Really? Are you serious?" he asked. Tori couldn't hear what the woman on the other end. "Well, okay then. When's the launch?" Tori leapt up. "What did you just say?" she exclaimed. Her dad explained. "The woman we met today represents a wealthy client who loves dogs. The client wants to send a dog to the International Space Station in honor of Laika, the Russian dog who was the first living creature to go into space. She thinks Max is the perfect choice for the trip." "Oh, I'm not so sure about that," said Tori. Outside, Max was airborne as he almost caught a frisbee thrown by Tori's brother. Her dad laughed. "It looks like he can do just fine with weightlessness," he assured her. Max would be going as a space tourist, but he still needed some training. Tori traveled with him to Houston, where astronauts train at the Johnson Space Center. It was serious business for the humans, who wanted to be sure that Max could withstand the forces of launch and the feeling of weightlessness in orbit. Max, however, seemed to think it was all fun and games. He swam in the water tank where astronauts train and used machines that simulate different parts of the space experience. He also made many new friends, including Commander Grant, who guided all the training. Launch day arrived at last. The media had made a big story of a dog going into space, so the launch drew an unusually large crowd to watch it. Tori and her family were there, of course. To help keep Max calm during the launch, NASA sent Commander Grant along with him. Excitement built as the announcer reached the end of the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff! We have liftoff of Max the dog, the first dog to visit the International Space Station. Tori used a video link to talk to Max and Commander Grant as their spaceship headed toward the space station. She had lots of questions. "Aren't you worried about crashing into the space station?" she asked Commander Grant. "I heard you were going fast enough to circle the world every 90 minutes. "That's true," he replied, "but we don't have to worry about a high-speed collision. Our speed is nearly the same as the space station speed, so for us it will seem that we are approaching it very slowly, even though we're both going very fast in our orbit." As the spaceship closed in on the space station, Tori watched a live video feed showing the view. "Wow," she said, "it's huge. What do all those different parts do?" Commander Grant pointed to the various parts as he replied. "The shiny solar panels provide the power," he said, "and all those cylindrical sections are where we live and work. We call them modules, and each one has a name." Commander Grant guided the spaceship to a perfect docking with the space station. Then Max and Commander Grant floated through the hatch, where they were greeted by the crew members already living there. Things did not go smoothly at first. Max was disoriented by being weightless. He tumbled aimlessly, annoying the crew. Watching on video, Tori asked, "Why are you weightless in space? I thought there's gravity everywhere." "Well, that's true," replied Commander Grant. "In fact, Earth's gravity holds our space station in orbit. We are weightless because we are in what we call free fall. That means that we don't feel the gravity." "What you call weight," he continued, "is really the feel of gravity making you push against the ground or floor. In space, there's no ground for us or our space station to push against, so we feel just as you would as if you were falling, and that makes us weightless." "Wait a minute," said Tori. "Does that mean I can become weightless just by jumping up into the air, since that would mean I don't feel the ground anymore?" "Exactly," answered Commander Grant. "The only difference is that you are weightless only for a short time until you come back down, while we stay weightless in the space station because our high speed keeps us orbiting the Earth." "Ah," said Tori, "so that's why you can tumble and twist like gymnasts and divers when they are in the air. It's kind of like you and the space station are falling toward the world together, which means you feel like a diver who never hits the water." By the second day, Max was getting used to being weightless, and the crew began to appreciate his playful personality. They especially loved mealtime, when they'd toss him food and blobs of water. Sometimes a crew member would give Max a little push so he'd be floating in the right direction for the catch. The only problem came when they tried to give Max a special steak that his trip sponsor had sent along for him. Max caught it just fine, but then let it go and began to whimper. Worried, Commander Grant called Tori to see if she knew what was wrong. Tori laughed when she heard the problem. "I know it sounds silly," she said, "but he won't eat the steak unless you cut it into small pieces. He doesn't realize how big he is, so he assumes he needs to eat like a small and sensitive dog." That evening, Tori went outside and caught a glimpse of the space station as it flew overhead. "Sweet dreams," she said softly to Max. Nighttime made Tori think of another question for Commander Grant. "How do you know when to go to sleep?" she asked. "With the space station circling Earth every 90 minutes, it seems like you'd have 45 minutes of daylight and 45 minutes of darkness on every orbit." "You're right again," said Commander Grant. "We have very short days and nights. It can be a little strange, but it also means we get to see lots of beautiful sunrises and sunsets. As to our schedules, we still use regular clocks, and we always make sure that everyone gets enough sleep." Back at home, Tori lay in bed and thought about the work the astronauts do on the space station. She knew that the astronauts spend much of their time doing science. They study Earth as they orbit above it and do experiments to learn how weightlessness affects things like living cells, plants, and small animals, the growth of crystals, and chemical reactions. They also do medical research that will help future astronauts on missions to distant worlds. Tori was soon asleep. That night, she dreamed of being a scientist and astronaut herself, taking trips not only to the space station but also to the Moon, Mars, Jupiter, and beyond. Tori woke up with excitement because this was going to be a very special science day. The astronauts were going to begin the next set of student spaceflight experiments, science experiments designed and built by students just like her. She and her friends were already thinking up ideas in hopes that they could design an experiment that might be selected one day. After breakfast, Tori watched a video feed showing the astronauts at work. Each experiment was stored in a special mini laboratory. The astronauts carefully unpacked each experiment and then started to set it up. Everything seemed to be going very well. But suddenly, Max began to bark. He had a very loud bark, and the crew was especially surprised because they had never heard him bark before. Max was clearly disturbed by something. Commander Grant quickly pushed himself toward Max. With worry in his voice, he asked, "What's wrong, Max?" Max would not stop barking no matter how much Commander Grant tried to calm him. Then Commander Grant noticed that Max was looking intensely in one direction. Commander Grant instantly realized the problem. The space station's cooling system was leaking, which meant that poisonous ammonia gas was getting mixed into the air as they breathed. Max and the astronauts would all be killed if they didn't do something quickly. Fortunately, the crew was well trained in how to stay calm and focused during emergencies. Commander Grant quickly determined that the leak would have to be repaired from the outside. His crewmates helped him get ready, and soon he had his spacesuit on and tools in hand. He went out through the airlock, using miniature jets on his spacesuit to get close to the cooling system. Then he used handles on the outside of the space station to anchor himself in place while he worked. In truth, the repair was very difficult, but you would have never known that from hearing Commander Grant as he worked. If he was ever worried at all, he never showed it. Soon he was back inside, problem solved. Commander Grant went to Max as soon as he was back in his regular clothes. "You're a real hero, Max," he said. "Without you, we might not have noticed the leak until it was too late." There was time for a break, so Commander Grant took Max to the cupola, the space station's room with a view. The view was spectacular, and it seemed to change everyone who ever saw it. After all, this was the International Space Station, where people from all over the world worked together in space. Was it really so difficult to imagine that people could work together the same way on the beautiful blue world below? For a little while, Max and Commander Grant just enjoyed watching out the windows as they circled around the world beneath them. Finally, Commander Grant knew it was time to broadcast a report to the people back home on Earth. He began by telling everyone how Max had saved the astronauts' lives. Then, knowing that many school children were watching and listening, he pulled out a book. "It's time for our story time from space," he began. The rest of Max's visit passed uneventfully for him, though the crew was busy working as always. Just a week after his arrival, it was time for Max to go home. Most of the other astronauts would remain aboard the space station for months, so they all gathered around to say goodbye to Max. They had all come to love him, and several of them suggested that it would be a good idea to send a dog on future space missions. Finally, they all posed for one last space photo with Max. Max was soon back on Earth. His legs were a little bit wobbly after a week of weightlessness, but he still had a big lick for Tori when she ran over to greet him. Max's trip had been everything anyone could have hoped. He'd become a hero, he'd honored dogs in space, and he'd gained the love and admiration not only of the astronauts, but of the people all over the world. Most importantly, his trip inspired children everywhere to work harder in school and to dream of their own trips to the space station and far beyond. With the journey complete, Max and Tori returned home, where Tori and her friends planned a big parade for Max. It would be a spectacular event. Meanwhile, high above, the International Space Station continues to circle our world. There is no sound to hear in space, so it circles silently. Completing an orbit every hour and a half, it reminds us that the planet we all share is remarkably small, and the narrow blue band of our atmosphere on the horizon reminds us that a thin layer of air is all that protects us from the harsh environment of space. Thanks to Max, many more people now understand what it all means. Working in space may someday help us learn to live on other worlds, but its greatest value is in the way it teaches us the importance of taking care of our own world. After all, no matter how far we travel in the future, Earth will always be our home planet, and if we don't take good care of our home, no one else will. The end. I hope y'all enjoyed. Special shout out to William and Charles. I love y'all. Good night.